They didn't just take down my fence, they erased it, like it had never existed, and by the time I got home from work, my yard felt like it had been opened up, exposed, like someone had peeled back a wall of my life without asking. I stood there for a minute in the driveway, keys still in my hand, just staring at the empty line where 6 feet of solid cedar used to run, and I remember thinking, this has to be a mistake. Except it didn't look like a mistake at all. It looked planned. I live on a corner lot. Nothing fancy, just one of those older neighborhoods where the streets curve a little too much, and every house has its own personality, some leaning toward charming, others toward, we'll get to it someday. Mine sits right at the bend, with a narrow side yard that runs along the east edge, and 5 years ago, after saving up longer than I'd like to admit, I had a privacy fence installed there. 6 feet tall, clean lines, solid posts sunk deep, everything done by the book, survey, permits, inspections, the whole thing. I remember the contractor even joking, this thing's gonna outlive both of us, and at the time, I believed him. The fence wasn't just about privacy. It was about boundaries, about having something that clearly said, this space is mine, this is where my life happens, and honestly, I took a weird kind of pride in it. I kept it stained, repaired a loose board here and there, nothing obsessive, just enough that it always looked like someone cared. Then, about 2 months before everything happened, the house next door sold. It had been sitting empty for a while, kind of sagging into itself, but within a week of the sale, there were trucks, equipment, guys in work boots moving in and out like it was a construction site, which, I guess, it became overnight. That's when I met him, not in any formal way, just one of those across the driveway introductions. I was dragging my trash bins back in, and he walked over, hand out, confident smile, the kind of guy who looked like he always had a plan. Name's Ryan, he said. I told him mine, and he glanced around like he was already redesigning everything he saw. Gonna give this place a full facelift, he said, nodding toward his house. New siding, widen the driveway, maybe extend the front porch, bring it up to date. I gave him a polite nod, something like, sounds like a big project. He smiled, a little sharper this time. Yeah, gonna need some room to do it right. At the time, I didn't think much of that line. Just figured he meant the usual construction mess. Trucks, materials, noise. I said, well, good luck with it. And that was pretty much it. Looking back, I think that was the first hint. I just didn't know it yet. 2 weeks later, it was a Tuesday, nothing special. One of those days that blends into every other workday. I left the house around 7 in the morning, coffee in a travel mug, running a couple minutes late like always, and as I backed out of the driveway, I remember seeing the fence out of the corner of my eye, straight, intact, exactly where it had been for 5 years. That image stuck with me later, more than I expected, because when I got home that evening, just after 6, everything was different. I pulled into the driveway, and at first, my brain didn't process it, it just felt off. Like walking into a room where someone moved all the furniture an inch to the left. Then it hit me. The fence was gone. Not broken, not partially removed, gone. Where it used to run, there was just open space, dirt, and a wide strip of freshly spread gravel bleeding over from the neighbor's side. My yard didn't feel like my yard anymore. It felt unfinished, exposed, like someone had taken a clean cut right through it. I got out of the car slowly, like moving too fast might somehow make it real, and walked over to where the fence should have been. The posts had been ripped clean out of the ground, leaving rough holes behind, and all the panels, every single one, had been stacked in a crooked pile near the back corner of my yard like discarded lumber. No note, no warning, no apology, just gone. I stood there for a long moment, trying to piece together what could have happened, and then I heard the sound of machinery next door, that low grinding hum of a skid steer, and I already knew. I walked over, crossed the invisible line that used to be marked by my fence, and found Ryan standing near his driveway, one hand raised as he directed the operator, like this was just another step in a normal workday. Hey, I called out, louder than I meant to. He turned, saw me, and for a split second, I thought I caught something in his expression, not guilt, exactly, more like annoyance at being interrupted. What happened to my fence? I asked. He didn't even hesitate. It was in the way, he said. Just like that. I blinked, honestly thinking I'd misheard him. In the way of what? He gestured vaguely toward the driveway area, where the gravel now extended much farther than it had before. We're widening the drive. Needed the space. I felt something tighten in my chest. That fence is on my property. He shrugged. Casual, almost bored. Our guy measured it. It was over the line. No. I said, sharper now, it wasn't. I had a survey done when it was installed. Another shrug, like that didn't really matter to him. If it's yours, you can put it back. We stacked it for you. Put it back. Like he'd done me a favor. I remember just standing there, the noise of the machine idling behind him, gravel crunching under boots somewhere, and realizing that this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was a decision he'd made, one where my side of the property line simply didn't factor in. And that was the moment something shifted for me. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet, steady realization that if I let this slide, even a little, I'd be giving up more than just a fence. I didn't argue any further right then. Didn't raise my voice, didn't threaten anything. I just nodded once, turned, and walked back to my house, because I knew this wasn't going to be settled in a conversation next to a running skid steer. That night, I pulled out the folder from my closing documents, the one I hadn't touched in years, and spread everything out on the kitchen table, deeds, permits, and finally, the survey. There it was, a bright, unmistakable line marking the property boundary, and just inside it, a note about the fence, installed 6 inches within my side, intentionally, to avoid exactly this kind of dispute. I sat back in my chair, staring at that line, and for the first time since I got home, I felt something close to calm. Not because the situation was okay, but because I knew, with absolute certainty, that I wasn't the one in the wrong. And if Ryan thought he could just erase a boundary like it didn't matter, then he had no idea what was coming next. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was angry in that loud, explosive kind of way, but because my mind just wouldn't shut off. It kept replaying that moment, him standing there so casually saying it was in the way, like my property line was just a suggestion, like 5 years of maintaining that space meant nothing if it didn't fit his plan. Around midnight I got up, poured myself a glass of water, and went back to the kitchen table where the survey was still spread out, and I just sat there staring at it again, tracing that boundary line with my finger like I needed to feel it, to remind myself it was real. By morning, I wasn't second-guessing anything anymore. I was focused. First thing I did was take photos, everything. The empty stretch where the fence used to be, the holes where the posts had been ripped out, the pile of panels dumped in the corner, and especially the gravel that had crept over onto my side like a slow spill. I even got down low and snapped a few shots of the ground line, just in case I needed to show how far things had shifted. It felt a little obsessive in the moment, but something in me said, document it now, figure it out later. Then I went back inside, scanned the survey, and sent Ryan an email. Kept it simple, no attitude, no threats, just facts. Attached the document, pointed out the boundary line, explained that the fence had been fully within my property, and asked him to respond so we could resolve it. I read it over twice before hitting send, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to make sure there was nothing in there he could twist. He never replied. By mid-morning, the sound of work next door had already started again. Engines, voices, the sharp clank of metal on metal. I stepped outside with my coffee and watched from the edge of my yard, not crossing over this time, just observing. That's when I saw it, wooden forms being set along the edge of what would become the new driveway. And they weren't guessing, they had a line, a clear, deliberate path that ran exactly where my fence used to stand. Something about that hit differently. Taking down the fence could have been brushed off as careless or aggressive, but setting forms? That meant they were moving forward, committing to it, pouring concrete over a line they had no right to cross. I didn't walk over, didn't say a word. I just went back inside, grabbed my keys, and drove straight to the city building department. Now, I'll be honest. I'm not the kind of guy who runs to city offices at the first sign of trouble. I've always been more of a handle-it-directly type. Keep things between neighbors. Don't escalate unless you have to. But this didn't feel like one of those situations anymore. This felt like someone had already decided the outcome, and I was just expected to accept it. Inside the building department, everything was quiet, fluorescent lights humming, a couple of people at the counter flipping through paperwork like it was just another routine day, which, for them, it probably was. I walked up, explained that there was active construction next door, and asked if I could see the approved permit and site plan for the driveway expansion. The woman behind the counter didn't even blink, just asked for the address, typed for a few seconds, and then disappeared into the back. When she came back, she handed me a printed set of documents. "Here you go," she said. "Approved last month." I thanked her, stepped aside, and started going through it right there, leaning against the counter. It didn't take long. Driveway width, 12 feet. Setback from property line, clearly marked. No encroachment. I read it again, slower this time, just to make sure I wasn't missing anything, and then I folded the papers carefully and walked back out to my car. When I got home, the crew was still working, forms nearly complete now, running straight and clean along the edge. I didn't need a tape measure to know something was off, but I grabbed one anyway. 14 feet. 2 extra feet. And when I followed that line visually back to where the property markers should be, it was obvious. At least a foot of that driveway was sitting squarely on my land. I stood there for a minute, tape measure still in my hand, feeling that same quiet shift happen again, that same steady clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't sloppy work. This was someone pushing past a boundary and hoping I wouldn't push back. So I did the one thing I knew would stop everything cold. I called the city and requested a site inspection. The next afternoon, an inspector showed up, mid-50s, calm, no nonsense, the kind of guy who didn't need to raise his voice to be taken seriously. He introduced himself, asked me to show him what was going on, and I walked him through it. The missing fence, the survey, the forms, the measurements. He listened, nodded once or twice, but didn't say much until he pulled out his own tools. Then he got to work. He located the survey pins first, took his time, brushed away dirt, confirmed positions, and then started measuring from those fixed points out toward the forms. I watched his face more than anything, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way he paused just a second longer than expected when he reached the edge of the forms. 14, he said finally, almost to himself. Then he stood up and looked over toward Ryan, who had walked over by then, hands on his hips, that same confident posture, though maybe a little less relaxed now. "Do you have a copy of your approved plans?" the inspector asked. Ryan nodded quickly. Yeah, we made a few adjustments out here, nothing major." The inspector didn't react right away, just held out his hand. Ryan hesitated for half a second, then went to grab the paperwork from his truck and handed it over. The inspector compared the documents to his measurements, flipping one page, then another, then looking back at the ground. "This is approved for 12 feet, he said, flat. Ryan gave a small shrug, trying to play it off. "Right, but we figured." The inspector cut him off, not loud, just firm. "Concrete doesn't count as a minor adjustment." There was a pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to make everyone aware of it. Then the inspector reached into his bag, pulled out a bright notice, and walked over to the front of Ryan's garage. I watched as he posted it right there on the door. Stop work order. No arguments. No negotiation. Just done. The crew didn't pack up immediately, but the energy shifted fast. Conversations got quieter, movement slower, like everyone suddenly realized the job had hit a wall they couldn't just work around. By sunset, the machines were off, the tools were loaded, and the site was quiet in a way it hadn't been since Ryan bought the place. That evening, just as the light was starting to fade, there was a knock on my door. I already knew who it was. When I opened it, Ryan was standing there, same guy, same clothes, but something about him had changed. The confidence was still there, but it was thinner now, stretched over something else, frustration, maybe, or the realization that things weren't going the way he expected. "Hey," he said, a little quieter than before. "Got a minute?" I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. He rubbed the back of his neck, glanced toward the driveway, then back at me. "Look," he started. "I think the contractor got a little carried away out there." I didn't say anything. He shifted his weight. "Tearing out those forms, that's going to cost me." I let that hang for a second, then said, evenly, "Tearing out my fence cost me." He exhaled through his nose, like he'd expected that, but still didn't like hearing it. "All right," he said, nodding slowly. "So what if we split it? I cover half the cost of a new fence, we call it even." I almost laughed, not out loud, but there was a moment where it hit me how predictable that offer was. "No," I said. He blinked. "No, I want the same fence rebuilt," I continued. "In the exact same position, 6 inches inside my property line, like it was before. And I want your driveway poured to the approved 12 feet. All of it in writing." His jaw tightened just slightly. "That's a lot." I held his gaze. It's exactly what was there before you decided it was in your way. There was another pause, longer this time. I could see him doing the math in his head, weighing options, thinking about costs, delays, pride. So I added one more thing, calm, almost casual. If we can't agree, I said, I'll move forward with a formal complaint. Trespass. Property damage. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't need to. The words landed exactly where they needed to. And for the first time since this started, Ryan didn't have an immediate answer. Ryan didn't answer right away, and that silence, more than anything he'd said up to that point, told me everything I needed to know. The confidence he'd been carrying around since the day we met, that easy assumption that things would just go his way, it wasn't gone, but it had cracked. You could see it in how he shifted his weight, how his eyes flicked past me toward the street like he was looking for an easier way out of the conversation. All right, he said finally, slower this time. All right, we can do that. No handshake, no smile, just an agreement that felt more like surrender than compromise. The next morning, things started moving in reverse. I watched from my kitchen window as the crew came back, not with the same energy they had before, but with that quiet, resigned pace of people undoing work instead of building it. The wooden forms came out first, piece by piece, stacked off to the side like they'd never meant anything. Then the gravel, that extra stretch that had spilled onto my property, it got scraped back, hauled away. The line slowly pulled back to where it should have been all along. It was strange to watch, not satisfying in a loud, triumphant way, but in something quieter, steadier. Like seeing a wrong being corrected frame by frame. A couple days later, the inspector came back out. Same calm demeanor, same measured steps. He checked the new layout, measured from the pins again, and this time, when he called out the number, it was 12. Clean. Exact. No hesitation. He signed off on it right there. Concrete got poured the following morning, and I'll admit, I stood outside for part of it, not because I didn't trust the process anymore, but because something in me needed to see it happen correctly. Needed to see that boundary respected, physically, permanently. Ryan was around that day, but he kept his distance. No directing, no casual comments, just a few short conversations with the crew and then back inside. Once or twice, our eyes almost met, but he always looked away first. The fence came last. About a week after everything had been reset, a different crew showed up, not the same guys who tore it down, which I found interesting, like even Ryan knew better than to have them handle this part. They unloaded new panels, fresh posts, hardware, everything clean, straight, untouched. I was already outside when they started. Had the survey in my hand again, same piece of paper that had sat on my kitchen table that first night, now folded and worn at the edges from being handled so much. One of the workers walked over. You the homeowner? Yeah, I said. He nodded toward the yard. You want to confirm the line before we set the posts? I held up the survey. Already got it. We walked it together, from one end to the other, checking the pins, measuring in that 6-inch offset, marking each post location carefully. There was something almost meditative about it, slow, deliberate, precise. When they set the first post, I stayed right there. Not hovering, not interfering, just present. Because this time, every inch mattered. The fence went up over the next 2 days, panel by panel, line by line, until that familiar boundary was back where it belonged. Same height, same clean look, maybe even a little better than before. And when it was done, I stood at the corner of the yard, looking down that line again, and for the first time since all this started, everything felt settled. Not forgotten, but settled. Ryan never came over to talk about it again. No follow-up, no attempt to smooth things over. No. Hey, we got off on the wrong foot. Nothing. The closest we came to any kind of acknowledgement was a brief moment one afternoon, maybe a couple weeks later, when we both happened to be outside at the same time. He glanced over. I glanced back. There was a split second where it felt like something might be said, but then he just gave a short nod, turned, and walked back inside. And honestly, that was enough. Because at that point, it wasn't about being friendly neighbors anymore. It was about understanding where the line was literally and otherwise. About a month after everything wrapped up, I noticed they'd started working on the front porch. New framing, extended footprint, just like he'd mentioned that first day we met. I didn't walk over, didn't measure, didn't say a word, but I did notice. And I think he knew I noticed. Because this time, everything moved a little slower, a little more carefully. Permits posted clearly in the window. Inspector visits happening right on schedule. No shortcuts, no minor adjustments. It was like the whole tone of the project had shifted. Not because the work changed, but because the awareness did. And every now and then, I'd catch myself thinking about that first day, him standing there, saying my fence was in the way, like it was just an obstacle to be removed. What he didn't realize back then, what he couldn't have realized, was that it was never really about the fence. It was about the line. About what happens when someone decides that line doesn't apply to them, and what it takes to remind them that it does. Because the truth is, I didn't set out to win anything. I didn't wake up that morning looking for a fight. Didn't want a stop work order slapped on his project. Didn't care about costing him time or money. But once that boundary was crossed, literally pulled out of the ground, there wasn't really a middle ground anymore. You either let it slide, or you stand your ground. And yeah, maybe there are people who would have handled it differently. Maybe some would have let him widen the driveway, taken the offer to split the cost, avoided the tension, kept things neighborly. I get that, but I also know how that story usually ends. Because it's rarely just one foot, or one decision, or one time someone decides your space is negotiable. It builds slowly, quietly, until one day you look around and realize the line you thought was solid has been pushed back so many times, it barely exists anymore. That wasn't something I was willing to let happen. So yeah, he tore down my fence. And I tore down his timeline. Not out of spite. Not for revenge in the way people usually think about it. But because sometimes the only way to protect what's yours is to make it clear, in a way that can't be ignored, that it matters. That you matter. And that some lines, once drawn, aren't up for negotiation. Now I'm curious what you think. Was I too strict about it? Should I have just worked something out and kept the peace? Or was this one of those situations where letting it slide would have cost more in the long run? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read all of them, and I'm honestly interested to hear where people land on this. Because when it comes to neighbors, boundaries, and doing what's right, it's never as simple as it looks from the outside.